Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about mastering limiters and the concept of mixing into your mastering chain. I want to talk about mastering limiters because for a lot of newer producers, they're all the same, right? I mean, it just hard limits my peaks, and they're all pretty much the same, and some have nicer interfaces than others, but they all sound pretty much the same, right? Well, the answer is no, they don't sound the same. And your choice of mastering limiter can very much affect how hard you can push a mix into the limiter and how loud you can make a mix before things start breaking up and getting a little too squishy and mushy and flattened out and soft sounding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk just briefly about the concept of why you might want to mix into a mastering limiter. So first things first, let's show you briefly a reference track. I'm not going to actually play it because I don't want to have this video flagged, but this is one of my favorite reference tracks from Res. I think it's brilliantly engineered and brilliantly mastered. And this is pretty typical for a bass music track. It's hitting about -5 LUFS integrated during the loudest portions of the song during the drop. I have a loop here in her second drop segment that's being measured alongside my stuff. And just briefly, let me show you two different mastering limiters. They're both set to be at a competitive loudness. Like, I'm not trying to get all the way up to -5 LUFS like some artists try to do, -5, -4. You can be a little bit less aggressive and still be in the right ballpark for DJs at festivals and clubs. The idea is you want your music to sound as saturated and dense and full of energy as all of the pro reference tracks are coming out. If you master down to -14 LUFS, like a lot of videos recommend and a lot of even mastering engineers recommend, it's like, oh, you should master to Spotify levels. No, you should not. Because if you master to those levels, your track isn't going to be as dense and saturated as it needs to be to literally sound similar to all the other tracks that all the other pro producers are doing, especially in the dance space and the festival space. Like, if you aren't hitting roughly -7 to -8 LUFS, ideally closer to -7 LUFS, you're not in the ballpark. Your music's going to sound quieter, softer, not as high energy. DJs are not going to want to mix that into their set alongside other stuff by, Res, Deadmau5, all the big dubstep artists, Lenium, Flume, all those guys, right? None of that stuff is going to match your stuff if you're mastering to -14. So, one of the struggles we have as dance music producers or as bass music producers is trying to, arrange our tracks and mix our tracks in a way that they can be successfully mastered all the way up to at least -7 LUFS integrated across the length of a drop, your loudest drop, while not falling apart. And there's some tricky things here. Certain sounds literally can't be pushed that hard or they'll fall apart. They'll get mushy, they'll get soft. And to demonstrate that principle, let me just briefly play a little bit of this drum pattern I have through a limiter called Elevate. Right now it's all being done in this FX selector, so I'm choosing which limiter we're going to listen to. And I've got an oscilloscope before showing the raw waveform from the pre-master that's being fed into the limiter, and then the oscilloscope of what's coming out of the limiter. So let's take a look at this real quick. Okay, so I'm going to freeze these waveforms and stop for a second, just talk about what we're seeing here and talk about what limiting does to your mix, okay? So here's the original mix. It's very dynamic. It's about 4.5 dB under the ceiling, right? So it's about -4.5 full scale. And this is the kick. This is the snare. The kick has a pretty sharp transient and kind of a triangular shape. The snare has an interesting transient. It kind of builds up. It has a little bit of a type sound to it. And then the highest part of the transient is actually slightly after it starts, and then it triangles down again. So it's a little bit of a loose snare. It's not a tight snare. It's got a little bit of a give to it. Okay. Now when both of these are being squashed through the limiter, this is the kick, this is the snare, this is the kick, this is the snare, and so on. And you can see that they're being sausaged. The kick is just right up against the ceiling on both sides at 0 dB full scale. So is the snare. But the kick has a much denser looking transient. There's a lot more energy. It's all being popped up, nice and punchy. The snare is a little bit more diffuse, again, because its transient is this kind of longer upward sloping transient. So keeping that in mind, listen a little more to how this sounds. Okay, so you can hear the snare's a good, not too tight, not too loose, just right, not too much reverb on it, so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to flip back and forth, and by the way, as you can see here, the elevate track is hitting exactly -0.7 integrated across, the repeating length of that pattern. And again, over here on the res reference track, you can see that over the course of this drop, it's hitting -5 integrated. And we have similar loudness ranges that, match the difference in the integrated levels. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is flip back and forth in real time between Elevate and FabFilter Pro-L. We're not going to bother with this meter back here. You're just going to have to trust me that I've also calibrated and set all the settings for Pro-L to also hit exactly -7 LUFS integrated. So I'm going to flip back and forth and not talk at all. And what I want you to listen for primarily is the difference in the timbre and punchiness and sharpness of the snare between these two. The kick is, to your untrained, if you're not listening really close, the kicks will sound basically the same between both limiters, but the snare should sound obviously different. Listen to the difference, see if you can figure out what the difference is. Watch the meter as I flip back and forth, and kind of also pay attention to the look of the snare transient when I'm in Elevate versus the look of the snare transient when I'm in Pro-L. You're going to see a slight difference to the look if you pay attention. So I'm going to be really quiet and just play this back and forth a few times. Both of these are hitting at exactly the same -7 LUFS. Here we go. Okay, that's enough of that. Hopefully, you realized that Elevate sounds quote unquote better. It sounds punchier, snappier. The snare sounds like it's got a good attack and transient length to it. It sounds smooth, it sounds balanced, it sounds bright, it sounds punchy. And you notice that the FabFilter Pro-L, the snare especially sounded a little more diffuse. It's like the little was a little more pronounced and fuzzy and lumpy and squashy, and that's what That's what the sound of a snare starting to break up into a limiter, being pushed too hard into a limiter. That's what a snare starts sounding like. It sounds lengthened out, and it's losing its snap and its punch and its transient. And it starts becoming more diffuse and distorted. That's what distortion sounds like on a snare transient. Now, the kick is also slightly more distorted in the FabFilter Pro-L version. It's also slightly softer and mushier, but it's not hitting the point yet where it's totally falling apart. It's just right at that threshold where it's starting to fall apart. Now, meanwhile, in Elevate, that kick and that snare are really close to the original kick and snare before any kind of limiting. And I'm going to demonstrate that in just a minute, but let's listen one more time to both of these at, the full -7 LUFS coming through each limiter. And I want you to also take a listen to the hi-hats and maybe even turn the volume down slightly so that you can hear the hi-hats a little more clearly against the kick and the snare. Sometimes when you turn things down, you actually hear other sounds better. And you'll notice that the hi-hats have a different quality in Elevate compared to Pro-L2. So again, let's start with Elevate. I'll be quiet. We'll go back and forth and just listen really carefully to the difference in the snare, and maybe also turn the volume down for a while and listen to the quality of the hi-hats as we go back and forth. Okay, so that should be enough listening time. And here's what I want to talk about. What happens when you drive things into a mastering limiter is a sharp transient, like you see right here, basically gets squashed and lengthened out a little bit. Now, the trick is maintaining that transient punch and sharpness, even though you've actually got this more squared off waveform that actually lasts longer, like here on this kick right here. That's a super sharp transient. These are both at the same exact kind of degree of zooming, right? A -35 offset, which gives them the same exact scale between these two oscilloscopes. And you can see that here's the total length of the kick, right, from here to here. And it's exactly the same over here as the total length of the kick. But what's happened is this entire kick's been lopped off right about where this line is. So that's why it looks completely straight through. But there's some magic happening in this particular mastering limiter to maintain this sharp transient for the kick, even though it's been sheared off right about here and just turned into a sausage. There's some tricks that certain limiters have to try and maintain that transient sharpness and that punch. Otherwise, this kick would just sound like a mushy, flabby instead of bump, bump, bump with some, some crack to it, some kick to it, right? And the same thing is happening with the snare. Again, here's a snare transient. It's a little bit of a weird transient for a snare. It's not a sharp snare. And again, it's getting lopped off right about here. And over here, you can see this is the snare at the point where it's being lopped off, okay? So the point is, when you drive sharp transient sounds into a mastering limiter, they effectively get spread out over time. And it's that spreading it out over time that makes the transient punch fade. And the harder you push it into the limiter, the more that thing fades, and it just suddenly becomes flabby and mushy and soft. Like a lot of engineers and producers will say, if you're distorting your kick and your snare by pushing too hard into the master, you basically make them sound too soft. They lose their punchiness. So here's the secret. All these loud mixes you hear that are competitive, pro dance music and festival music, bass music, mixes, they're all distorted. They've all been softened up, but there's a lot of tricks we can employ in our mixing approach and in our mastering approach and tools. Like there's a bunch of things happening in the chain before I even get to this point of the limiter that are helping to set up this kick and snare to survive the push through the limiter all the way up to -7 LUFS without falling apart too much. And that's the key. All of the really good, best reference tracks you've got that are super loud and yet sound clean and don't sound over compressed, they just sound very hyped and hot. There's tricks we're doing to like find that balance of how far you can squash these important transients without really losing so much that it becomes obviously soft and flabby. That's the whole trick, okay? So getting back to limiters and the difference between something like Elevate versus Pro-L, which everyone loves Pro-L. I used Pro-L exclusively for a long time. I also have Ozone. I've had all the versions of Ozone up through current version 9. I tended to like Pro-L more as time went on because Ozone became more of a black box and you had to trust their mastering assistant. I don't like using their mastering assistant because it's not really set up for loud dance music and festival-oriented bass music. So over time, I was taught different approaches to mastering that, relied on a limiter more like Pro-L2 at the end where, we've got this great metering and Pro-L2 is just a good, great, transparent limiter. But then recently, in the last year or so, this thing from Eventide Newfangled Audio called Elevate came along. And at first, I was really intimidated by this limiter. It's got a lot going on, a lot of controls. It's like things that used to be very transparent to me as a user are suddenly like exposed to me. And you get to get into the guts of the limiter and really change some very important settings that very much affect the sound coming out of the limiter. Whereas, something like Pro-L, it's just, okay, think about how far a look ahead you want, think about how much attack and release time you want, decide how much you want the stereo transients linked together and compressed at the same time versus independently, and there's, their basic algorithms are strong. Most of the producers I know will use either the modern algorithm or the aggressive algorithm if they want it to sound a little more hot and saturated and clipped. And it does the job well. It's a great limiter. But you heard a difference between this, my old workhorse, versus Elevate. When you really understand Elevate and you apply it correctly, it sounds amazingly close to the original, even though I'm pushing the hell out of this music. So that's what I want to demonstrate now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to both of these limiters, and I'm going to turn on their gain compensation for A being with it on and off. So you do that in FabFilter by clicking this little yellow thing here, this one-to-one thing. And over here in Elevate, you do it by clicking this auto button. And so what these two settings are going to do now is if I toggle them on and off, if I turn Elevate on and off with this button, or if I turn, actually, no, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. What I'm going to do is now I've basically said when you turn these buttons on, sorry, because there's a different mode in Elevate that does a different thing, and that's where my brain was heading. This button here and this button here in FabFilter, what they basically say is apply the limiting, but then turn the output volume down to match the original signal that's being fed into you so that you're basically hearing it at the same normalized equal loudness as the original signal. And so what that allows you to do is then A/B this on and off. In FabFilter, you would click this little button to turn it on or off. And over here in Elevate, you would turn this button to turn it on and off. You might want to turn that match level off too, right? But anyway, the point is you can A/B what the limiter sounds like versus the original dry signal and decide how far you can push it before the limiter is affecting the sound too much and making it too soft and fuzzy and distorted and squash sounding, right? So it's a trick for helping you set your limiter. Now, in this particular case, I have this FX selector rack set up in Bitwig, which lets me just basically click these little buttons right here to say, show me the original or show me Elevate or show me Pro-L2 and just jump back and forth that way. So I don't have to click buttons in these to bypass. It's just an instant quick switch. It's one of the things I love about Bitwig is these FX selector and instrument selector devices. So this time, let's start out with the original mix. This is at negative 4.5 dB full scale, no limiting whatsoever. And then I'm going to bounce through Elevate and Pro-L2 in their compensated output volumes. So they're going to sound at exactly the same volume. And instead, you're going to hear the timbral differences between the original, Elevate, and Pro-L2. Okay. Now, because the volume is going to be a lot lower than it was before, you're going to want to turn up your volume right now. And I'm going to be very careful about not talking into the microphone and blowing out your ears. I'm just going to go away and stop talking for a little bit and pop back and forth between the original and Elevate and then the original and Pro-L2 and just back and forth comparing these two against the original so you can hear exactly what these settings sound like relative to the way the original sounded. And if I do talk, I'm going to talk really far away from the microphone like this to remind you that I'm about to start talking again, and you can turn the volume down before I start really talking. Okay, so I'll be quiet for a while and just bounce around between these three settings. Okay, I'm about to talk. Okay, giving you time to turn your volume down again. So hopefully as I went back and forth between the original versus Elevate and the original versus Pro-L2, you could hear the significant difference between the original and Pro-L2, but you could also hear how similar Elevate sounded to the original. In other words, Elevate was the far more transparent of the two limiters. Even after pushing this pre-master all the way up to -7 LUFS, okay? What you noticed in Pro-L2 is that the snare in Pro-L2 was really fuzzy, was really soft compared to the original snare. Now, even Elevate can't exactly match the sharpness and envelope of the original snare, but it's pretty damn close. I mean, it's really close. If you hadn't heard it against the original, you would just think, wow, that's a really good snare. That just sounds sharp. It has a good snap and crack to it, despite being a little bit of a softy, fuzzy snare to begin with. And then, of course, the kick sounded the same. The bass is a little softer, but that's another thing that happens with mastering limiters because they have to push all that sub energy down in order to like make the headroom to push everything back up to a nice loud level. So the bass sounds a little bit softer in Elevate versus the original, but not too much softer. And it's about par for the course. And we would actually compensate for that during final mastering by actually pushing the bass up a little bit, playing some games with the sub just a teeny bit. So let's talk about why Elevate works better. And it mostly has to do with the fact that Elevate tells you what's going on under the covers. Elevate is a spectral limiter. And it's possible that the algorithms for all the other mastering limiters are also to some degree spectral, but maybe not as many multiple different bands as Elevate. Or they might be broadband limiters. We don't know. Most of the vendors don't tell us what their algorithms actually do. But my guess is in order to do even halfway intelligent and decent limiting, and the point of having different algorithms is that you probably have some degree of multi-band processing happening in a limiter, where it's compressing certain bands differently than other bands in the spectrum. Now, Elevate makes no bones about this. In fact, Elevate lets you set up exactly the bands you want. By default, there's 26 bands in something called the Mel scale. That's what I stick with. You could make entirely custom bands, more bands, fewer bands. You could adjust exactly where the crossovers in each band is. But either way, the point is it's operating on 26 different bands at the same time. And when it's limiting, it's doing a certain amount of gain reduction per band. And it's got these settings to do things like adaptive gain, which means if your overall push on the limiter is positive 8.5 dB, instead of just applying that equally across every single band of the spectrum, it's instead saying you can stray as far as plus or minus 6 dB up or down from where a broadband limiter would work. Like, so you can individually tailor how you're responding to each band, and you can even make this adaptive range a lot higher, like plus or minus 12 dB on either side. And then the same thing is going on with transients. This has a transient emphasis algorithm, just like every other limiter. But here, your overall transient emphasis can further be made dynamic and adaptive so that depending on what kind of material is coming in, it may emphasize the transients here in the low mids differently than it emphasizes the transients up here versus the sub and so on. So let's look at this in action. Let's watch what Elevate does here in action. I am going to turn off these settings one more time, just so that we don't have to play volume games anymore. So if my voice is comfortable to you now, this will sound about right. So let's look at what the limiter is doing first. So you can see from these little orange bars up here, it's doing different amounts of gain reduction across the bands depending on what the spectrum looks like at any given moment. All right, and the same thing is happening for the transients. Watch how the transient response is emphasized differently for each band. Okay, so in a nutshell, it's this adaptive transient emphasis where I'm in about the mid-range and I'm saying, I want you to have full control over how far you deviate from this general setting and, adjust transients independently to some degree. That's what's allowing Elevate to bring back the punch after the squash. It's like it does the limiting and then it plays games with the transients after they've been limited and pushes them back up again, right? And emphasizes those transients. It kind of recreates this look and feel on the other side of the initial limiting, right? So it's doing limiting first, and then it's applying this intelligent spectral transient shaping. It's brilliant. And it's making the post limited thing kind of look and feel a little more like the original shape, right? Instead of just a squashed sausage. And then, well, you say, but then that's going to put things up above zero again, isn't it? Right? And the answer is yes, it is. That's why it has a final stage, which is a clipper. And so it just clips those transients off at whatever your ceiling is again. And even better, you can drive this clipper. You can actually add a little bit more saturation after everything is done with the limiting and the transient shaping to add even more sizzle and hotness to it if it's not quite there yet, right? So this approach to limiting is very similar to when you see your favorite producers, like, I don't know, Virtual Riot, say, look, I'm clipping into red on the master. Listen to how crazy this sounds. And it's like, I don't care. I'm an outlaw, right? They're doing that because sharp transients, especially on kicks and snares, the things that are probably the loudest, most prominent sounds in the mix, a really sharp transient, you can lop it off really hard. And it'll still sound good if you're not overdoing it too much. And so when you see producers clipping the master, that's all that's happening. Is they're pushing this level where most of this RMS sound is, where most of the volume is, the big broad waveform portion. They're pushing that right up close to 0 dB, and they're letting the master ceiling at 0 dB just lop all these transients off for the kick and the snare just right across the top, which is effectively the same thing as doing a 100% hard limiter by a certain amount of dB. Right? That's effectively what's happening. So what this particular limiter lets you do is kind of emulate that, but all inside the limiter so you don't ever have to actually go over zero on your master bus, right? It's doing its squashing, then it's reshaping transients after the squashing in a very smart and intelligent and strong way. And I'm going to show you that strongness in just a minute, like how crazy it is. And then it's created these transient peaks again, and then it just shaves them off. But because the transient peaks are really short, when you shave them, it sounds good. It's a good, pleasant kind of distortion. And you can even further drive after the basic shaving. You can shave it even more. You can push it into the limiter a little bit, and you can make it either a soft kind of limiting or a hard kind of limiting or anything in between. So my typical technique, and this is this is kind of one of the main tricks I wanted to show you in this video, is I will often start out very early in a project, like with my drums. I'll pick my kick and snare and my drum pattern, and I'll kind of solo those. Maybe I'll solo the whole drum bus. And I have this limiter is pretty much set up like you see here by default, right? But then what I'll do is I'll fine-tune just a little bit some of these settings, especially this clipper amount and shape. I'll fine-tune some of those settings. I'll fine-tune how much I'm driving it by testing my original kick and snare that I want to use in the project. I'll drive them into this limiter. I'll push them up to -7 LUFS with the rest of the drum track that may exist at that point. And I'll just make sure that this kick and this snare are going to survive being pushed and squashed through -7, right? Being pushed and squashed through this process. Will it survive? Because a lot of kicks and snares won't. That's a whole nother subject for a whole nother video. Sometimes you have to choose very specific kicks and snares that can be pushed this loud without getting softened up. Okay? So what I will do, I won't have these two channels here. I'll just have an FX selector rack that's basically just letting the original dry signal through, and then one chain with Elevate on it. And I will double check with this auto output engaged. I will double check the original against Elevate, and I'll go back and forth, and I'll play ever so slightly with the transient emphasis And with the speed and with the clipping amount and even the clipper shape, I'll play with this, the emphasis especially, and the speed to try and find a setting in Elevate that sounds almost exactly like my original, right? So again, here's the original. It's going to be a lot lower in volume, but I won't talk for a minute. So listen to the original, listen to Elevate, and what I'm going to show you during this is I'm going to show how drastic a difference just messing around with the transient emphasis can make. All right, here's the original. Okay, I'm going to talk. All right, I'm talking. I'm getting closer to the microphone. So here, I've dragged down the transient emphasis all the way to 0, which means basically don't emphasize the transients. Just do the limiter and pretty much ignore this, right? Or do it very, very lightly. Now, if you listen carefully to the difference between the original and Elevate, with this slider all the way down here, you're going to notice how long and dragged out the snare is. It's just diffuse, it's soft, it's got no punch, it's just this long type snare, right? Compared to the original, which is pretty snappy. Okay, so again, I'm gonna stop talking, listen just mainly to the snare and hear how drastically different the snare sounds and went through the limiter versus the original. Okay, I'm going to talk. I'm coming back. I'm coming back closer to the mic. Okay, so you can hear that obviously this limiter with these settings to get it up to -7 lefs, the transients are too mushy. It's too soft. It's affecting the kick too, although you don't hear it as much because this kick survives the crush a little bit better than the snare does. The snare is the weak spot in this particular drum track. Now, depending on the song, I might want a really tight, poppy, percussive snare, and I might not need as much transient emphasis. So again, this slider especially is something you have to sort of tailor and tune for your kick and your snare in your project. And if you change the kick or you change the snare later in the project, you'll probably want to mess with this again and do a little bit of A-B. So that's why I love Bitwig, because it lets me set up racks like this that make it super easy to just say, let me compare the original dry against my limiter. And as I work through this project and change things up and change the mix up, I can always be coming back here occasionally, double checking how things sound as they're pushed through the limiter, see how they're surviving that crush, and then maybe making some mild tweaks by A-Bing my original dry mix versus the limiter mix. Original dry, limiter, right? Really good technique. I recommend in your mastering chain, if you're going to set up a limiter and practice mixing into a limiter, this is a good trick that'll save you tons of time. You just get those volumes balanced out, A-B back and forth. So again, At 52% is where they sound almost identical. They're about as close as they can be in terms of that envelope and punch of the original snare versus elevate. Let's try this again. Okay, you can hear they're very similar. Now, elevate's the whole track is a tiny bit brighter, but again, that's what limiting does. You know, limiting is like a compressor. It's pushing the dynamic range down and then regaining everything up to the ceiling. And so all those sounds that used to be a little more quiet and in the background are now suddenly far more audible. So your more quiet sounds in the mix suddenly become louder. And that's what adds that hotness, that sense of energy and sizzle and density and saturation is, you know, all these quieter sounds in the middle are now suddenly a lot more obvious and loud because they've been pushed up to here. Okay. So it's normal for it to get a little more bright. What you tend to listen for when you're trying to set the right transient emphasis is like, listen to the envelope of the snare. How long does it last? How sharp does it sound? How does it crack? And can you get really close to that same amount of crack by adjusting this slider? Now, if I push this even higher, you're going to hear that it gets a little too cracky, and I can actually lose that kind of basic woof sound that the original has. Listen closely to the original for just a second. It's not a piercing snare. It's kind of a soft, mellow snare. It's got some crispness to it, but it's kind of, you know, the transient is dragged out a little bit. Now, if I push elevate up even to like there, just that much more, listen to the difference between the original and elevate now. Suddenly the elevate version is going to sound a lot snappier. There's going to be that transient's going to be faster and sharper and not as dragged out. So the snare itself is now going to sound sharper and more like a crack. Okay, really obvious, noticeable difference in just this much movement on the transient emphasis slider. So again, the thing I'm hoping you're going to get from this video is that your mastering limiter does matter very much, and especially being able to get under the hood behind the algorithm. You know, FabFilter is a black box to a large degree. Yeah, sure, you have control over attack and release. That's the same as the speed setting over here on elevate. And, you know, just like you might want to play with attack and release over here, it's going to be a little different for every song. You're going to have different quality depending on how fast or slow you're attacking and releasing. It's the same over here with this slider. This much of a drag up to here is going to make it sound very different than here, or sound very different if it's all the way at the bottom or all the way at the top. So you're going to want to play with these two, but this is the big one right here, transient emphasis. And the idea is, well, at least throughout the early part of your project, try and, you know, occasionally come and check your mix as it's being fed through your mastering chain and compare the original dry versus how the elevate settings are and adjust the transient so it sounds pretty much the same. Then later on, when you're in final mastering and you're really trying to decide about the last elements of the mix, you can decide, you know what, I really want the kick and snare even more aggressive to really like pop and shine right through that mix. Despite all my side chaining and everything else, I still feel like the kick and the snare don't have quite enough punch and presence. Boom, no problem. Push this slider up just a little bit and you'll be surprised how much extra volume and punch it's going to give just to the snare and the kick, right? In a good mix. Or if you want to soften them out because they're a little too present, you can go in the other direction slightly. And so you can get some really fine tuning of that punch of all your transients, your hi-hats, your kick, your snare, everything. With this slider, it's very, very powerful, very strong. So zooming out to my bigger process, just to briefly show you kind of how I think about things. I have a template. This is my basic template. Lots of groups. I have lots of different sidechain ducking happening across different groups, depending on where they are, what group it is. There's a lot of things in my template that are already turned on. There's a lot of things that are sitting there ready to use, but not turned on. You can kind of get a better view of that in the mixer view. Like I've got glue compressor and ozone exciter and saturate, which is also from Elevate. I've got these ready to go on my this particular drum bus, but they're not turned on by default. So by having only the things I really care about turned on by default, it makes the project load up faster every time I reopen it. But the point is I have all the things that I know I use every time in every project set up and ready to go, especially the duckers and the ducking routing. And I've touched on this in some of my other videos. I have instances of Pro-Q3 on pretty much every bus so that I can do the masking analyzer between things. And I have on my master bus, I have a pretty lengthy chain, but by default, this whole master check container is deactivated, like completely deactivated. So it doesn't try to load anything up. It's just not in memory. It doesn't affect CPU. It doesn't affect latency. In fact, if I press 0 to deactivate it, you can see how my latency on the master bus suddenly dropped phenomenally down to only 46 milliseconds. And if I activate this again, everything I had inside it will be turned on and reinstantiated up under here. It's done. That's how fast it is. God, Bitwig's fast. And so it's that easy for me to trigger on and off a double check of how all my sounds are working when they're crushed through the master chain. Let me get rid of this oscilloscope, and let me get rid of this one and show you what it really looks like most of the time. I'm also going to get rid of Pro-L and my clip master. Okay, so this is what I really have sitting inside here is I have a chain device with two different racks or chains inside it. One of them is my standard mix bus chain. The other one's my mastering chain. Sure, I'll give you a preview. These are all the things in my mix bus chain. Yes, I use FabFilter Pro MB. Yes, I use Smart EQ2 by Sonable. Yes, I use a thing from Ozone 9 that's awesome called their new low-end focus plugin. Yes, I use Gullfoss. It's amazing. Yes, I even use Oxford Inflator because you can never have enough saturation. And I use Kramer Master Tape from Waves, which also provides a kind of saturation. And this saturation and this saturation, they do a certain amount of sort of dynamic range reduction and crest factor shaping to begin with before I even get over into my mastering chain. It's like this is just some basic stuff that adds color and a certain amount of hype and energy, and also controls my crest factor going into the mastering chain. And this is all here in my mix bus chain. Someday I may talk about this in more detail, but the main thing I wanted to show you is even early on in a project, when I toggle on this master check, I want a lot of these things activated. I do very specific things with Pro MB. I shape my waveform. I use this like a graphic EQ. I learned this trick from White Sea Studios. Brilliant guy. Love his approach to using Pro MB. I use almost exactly the same thing, and I just basically drag these colored dots up and down as kind of a really broad, rough sketch compressor slash EQ on the balance of my mix. These are my default settings. Then I have Smart EQ turned off by default because this is something you only do at the very end when you're like final mix down and mastering, because Smart EQ is it needs to hear what everything sounds like at that point and then make some decisions and help you out. So different story, different time. You've seen me use it in other videos. Ozone low-end focus. I basically just use it in mid-side mode, and by default, I give the mid a tiny bit more punch. It's just a way to help control the mud down in that range a little bit and help improve the transient definition of the sub and the kick. Gullfoss stays off until the very end because, like Smart EQ, it's dependent on what the mix sounds like at the end of things when everything's done. And it just adds its little magic sheen. I have another video where I talk about Gullfoss. It's amazing. Now, inflator and Kramer master tape, inflator is just doing its default give it to me, baby, right? I want it to do a certain amount of its coloring and saturation. And Kramer master tape, I might have to adjust the input level to keep it in this roughly -5 dB range. I just let it do a little bit of saturation in that colored way that it does, because it adds a little bit of an analog softness to everything. And then, so, I want those to just instantly kick on and be engaged when I turn on this master check thing, right? And then over here in the mastering portion of the chain, I'm using saturate also by Newfangled. And I'm basically doing a certain amount of semi-soft hard clipping at a certain amount of drive, just by default. Because I know from the way that I mix and do my project that there's transients hitting into this that can be safely clipped without affecting really the sound at all. And so it's just a way of doing a little bit of light crust factor shaping before I run into the actual limiter here. And then I have dithering turned off, and this is ozone spectral shaper that is sometimes useful for reducing harshness that happens as you do the mastering push. So sometimes I'll do a little bit of resonance control with spectral shaper. And that's pretty much what's going on here. So because both of these chains are inside of another chain device, I can literally just toggle it on and off with one button click. Right? I can A/B my dry mix versus let's double check and hear how it sounds being pushed through an entire mastering chain all the way up to -7 LUFS. Boom. Everything sound good? Are any of my sounds falling apart? Is that new super I just added becoming ridiculously harsh? Is it falling apart? Is that different kick I'm trying out, is it surviving the push, or does it sound flabby and soft when I toggle this on and off? And I'll literally just toggle it on and off and do a little A/B check. Just like you're often advised to do a mono check periodically, right? Go find some tool that can do monoing. My favorite is this little thing by Mott called 2-bus control. And I'll do mono checks periodically just by clicking this button, right? So just like you would mono check periodically as you go, right from the very beginning of a project. Does this bass sound good in mono? If I mono this bass out, does it lose a whole lot of energy? Do I have problems with my correlation? You'd use a mono check for that, right? And you do it all the time. Every new sound you add, you might do a quick mono check to it, make sure it's mono compatible. And in the same way, you can quickly activate this thing, load it up, add a whole bunch of latency to your project for a few seconds, run it on and off, listen to it dry, listen to it pushed up to -7 LUFS, see how your sounds are surviving that push. And if they're not, go pick a different sound or go program that sound differently. And again, this is what's awesome about Bitwig compared to like live, okay? If I press my 0 key to literally not just disable it, but deactivate it, this little circle means everything in this chain is gone. It's not in memory. It's not affecting CPU. The latency is gone. Everything's gone. No project impact at all. Just gone. Now I'm going to turn it on again, and let me tell you when it's done loading the plugins. You can't see it because the loading dialog's up under my icon here, but I'm just going to press the key, and everything's loaded. All that stuff is loaded that fast. Deactivate it, it's gone. Right? So it can be that simple to set up a complex, heavy impact mastering chain and actually check your mix through it. And when you get into final mixdown, well, this amount of latency and overhead, I mean, 600 milliseconds of latency is nothing when you're in final mixdown and mastering. You don't care. You only care about latency when you are recording, when you're tracking, because you don't want, a whole lot of delay between what you're recording and what's actually being played in the project. But mixing, mastering, who cares? Doesn't matter. As long as your CPU usage is fine, you're in good shape. So I personally highly recommend start thinking about mixing into your mastering chain. Not all the time, not on 100% of the time, just when you want to double check things. Make sure sounds are surviving that push, right? And this isn't just me. I've learned this from I stand on the shoulders of giants, okay? I've been very fortunate over the last couple years to have access to a amazing crew of talent and knowledge. And one of those people is Seth Drake, who's the mastering engineer for Bass Nectar, Gucci Mane, so on and so forth. In fact, Seth right now is actually teaching a lot of my co-producers in my collective, Producer Dojo. He's actually there teaching them these kinds of concepts and his specific technique. And a lot of my technique is really based on things I've learned from Seth over the last couple of years from asking questions or just paying attention to how Seth answers other people's questions. So I've been really lucky. And Seth would be the first to tell you, yes, mix into your mastering chain. Yes, absolutely. Otherwise, you're never going to get the right kind of loudness, because if I were to turn off this mastering chain for a perfect mix that sounds great when it's mastered and pushed all the way up to -7 LUFS, if I turn off the mastering chain and you were to listen to my pre-master, you'd say, that's a shitty mix. That's a weird mix. Why? Those drums are way too loud and other things are way too soft. And so this is not right and that's not right. The balance, the leveling seems wrong. And that's because all those rules that most of the YouTube videos teach you and the isotope people teach you and so on, they're not for bass music. They're not for electronic music. They're not for dance music. They're not for clubs and festivals. They're not for modern pop music even, really. If you make a perfect mix that sounds great and sounds exactly like your reference track over here in whatever referencing tool you use, like if I were to mix with this mastering chain off and make my mix, my pre-master mix, sound exactly like the timbre and saturation and density of a reference track like this one, and then I say, well, I'm done with my mix. It sounds exactly like my reference thing brought down to the level that I'm mixing at, right? And now I'm going to take that perfect mix and run it through a mastering chain and get it pushed up to -7 LUFS. If you do that, it's going to sound like complete hammered crap. It will not sound right. Everything will fall apart because those important sounds, the kick, the snare, the sub, which are cranked and sounding perfect in the pre-master, you push that up to 7 LUFS in a limiter and it's just going to turn them into mush, right? So instead, you have to start with the mastering chain already set up kind of based on your kick and snare, like I just spent the last 20 minutes, 30 minutes showing you. And sub, right? Kick, snare, and sub are all in that sample that I kind of used to set my basic default settings for Elevate and my default things in my mastering and mixing chain. You have to make sure that sounds good right from the start. And then periodically, as I add new sounds and do some leveling and balancing, I'll do my leveling and balancing as I go with this on through the mastering chain. Okay, that's super important because then you're balancing and leveling everything in a way that is going to like come out the other end sounding like a good mix that actually matches your reference track. And that's the other little tip is never, all these referencing tools have the ability to do things like normalize and do loudness matching so that you can take all these super loud reference tracks and drop them down to the same loudness as your project, which is probably, happening at -6 dB or less overall. Don't do that. Instead, let these things play at their normal volume. If you're gonna make a song sound kind of in the same ballpark as this reference track, you want this at full volume. You want to be seeing all these numbers at the full level of the reference track, right? And then you want to hear what your stuff sounds like through a mastering chain pushed up to the same ballpark level as your reference track. That's the key to referencing. Then, and only then, can you really find a kick and a snare that sound like the reference track. Can you make your subs sound like the reference track? Can you make your mid basses sound like the reference track? Can you make your balancing and leveling sound like the reference track? You got to hear it push through your mastering chain and then compared to the unmitigated, unchanged master, right? Because there's all kinds of things going on, like True Peak. all these limiters, all these tools, true peak, true peak, true peak. Oh my God, don't go over 0 dB true peak. In fact, if you're going to go to Spotify or any kind of MP3, you should actually make your ceiling -1 true peak. No, no, nobody does that. Nobody gives a shit about that. None of the pros care about that. None of the record companies care about that. It's hogwash. In the dance and pop world, it's hogwash. Put your ceiling at 0 dB. No true peak limiting. Let those true peaks hit +2, +3, +4. They don't matter because they're so short. They're so tiny. They're so transient. They get clipped. It sounds okay in a typical mix where your drum, your kick, and your snare are the loudest things in the mix. And they're getting clipped a little bit over true peak. Sure, fine, no problem. Does it sound good? Do you hear distortion? Do you hear them getting too soft? Then no problem. And if you load up reference tracks from all your favorite artists, if you go find the actual wave files and load them up, you're going to see none of them care about true peak. You'll see true peak overs like crazy. You'll see all of them. The ceiling over here is set at 0 dB, period. None of this -0.3, none of this -0.5, none of this -0.0. If I play this res track, it's hitting 0 peak with no true peak limiting, right? And that's true of almost every reference track I've ever looked at from the artists I care about, who I think have great masters and great mixes. So all those rules you hear, they're kind of holdovers from the 70s and 80s when rules were different and music was different. Yes, they're still applicable to other genres, maybe like rock and jazz and stuff like that. Yes, 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 yes. I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm saying it's misguided for the dance and pop music scene of the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, maybe 10 years, right? People like saturated loud mixes. True peak does not matter. Yes, mix through your mastering chain. It's the way the pros do it. Okay, so hopefully this has been enlightening. Hopefully this has been helpful, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for hanging out with me.